Jori, Epstein, Frank Schwab. I'm Jason Fitz. It is time for Inside Coverage. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday to the world. And we already have coaching news. I cannot believe this. We sit here. We haven't even played Week 18, and we find out the breaking news this morning. Mike Vrabel is in Jersey, where he will be interviewing with the New York Jets. Important to note here, he becomes the first candidate to be interviewed by the Jets. The Jets get ahead of everybody else that may want to interview Vrabel. And as the NFL Network pointed out, they're doing the interview at the facility. So it gives him a chance to get to know everybody and see what the place is like. There's a lot to this. Jori, are you at all surprised that the Jets are the first on the Vrabel train here?
I mean, I think it's smart that the Jets are the first on the Vrabel train because in order to be interviewing now, you need a couple of things. You need, one, the coach to already be available to interview, and two, the team to already be able to interview the coach. And so from a coaching standpoint, you need a coach who is not under contract with a regular season team. And soon it's going to be with a playoff team that will even delay some people further because the league recently changed the rules to make sure that you can't interview in person for a certain number of hours until you're a certain level of depth into the playoffs or no longer in the playoffs. And then from a team standpoint, like if you're the Jacksonville Jaguars, Doug Peterson is still your head coach. And even if it's expected that he won't be the coach in 2025, it's not an NFL practice for teams to start hiring before someone is literally out of the building. And so I think that's what's interesting. And I think we see this one. Mike Vrabel got released from his Browns consulting contract a week early so that he could do this. I think that it's possible that the Jets aren't even the only coach in the New York area that would interview Mike Vrabel. And so if the Jets really want him, they might as well, I would say if they really want him, they should make that full court press now. And if they think they want him, they should try and get that information to determine that now. So it makes a lot of sense to me. That I'm not surprised because it's really one of the few edges both sides have right now.
I think it's a smart move. I just wonder who's courting who. Like, does Mike Vrabel want the Jets? That's the thing. He could talk to him right now, and that, like you talked about, it's smart by the Jets. They kind of stumbled into it because nothing the Jets do is really smart, but they can interview him now before everybody else. What do the Jets have to sell, really, on Mike Vrabel? Like, that's just it's a bad organization. Everybody knows it. Like that, all the Woody Johnson stuff. We've already know. We might not have known the specifics, but we knew. Like, it's a dysfunctional organization. Mike Vrabel, I assume, is going to have options. He's a great coach. Now, if the Jets could land him, I think it's a big hire for the Jets. Like that, he'd be like, when Rex Ryan's name is being brought up, you're like, well, I didn't expect it, but if we think about it, Rex Ryan's probably their best coach of the last 30 years. Like, okay, like he's the only one that's really had any level of success there. So I think it works on multiple levels. I just don't know if Mike Vrabel's going to want the Jets, honestly. It's kind of like the Bears job. Like when we're talking about Ben Johnson, like it's not the Bears trying to land Ben Johnson. It's Ben Johnson. Does he want the Bears? It's one of those weird courting things where the team's not courting the coach. The coach is courting the team. And the Jets are just a tire fire right now. I don't know that any really good candidate would want to go coach there with Aaron Rodgers on his way out and no real solution at quarterback and a lot of aging guys who they put around Aaron Rodgers to try to win this year. And that didn't obviously happen. So long story short, I think it would be a great hire for the Jets if they can land Vrabel. I have a lot of respect for him as a coach. I just don't know that's Mike Vrabel's best opportunity.
Can I tell you though, Frank, I feel like almost every team either doesn't have the talent or doesn't have the ideal ownership or situation or has a front office. And I'm sure this is just a really common situation that everyone is going to be able to say, I don't know who you're talking about, that has a GM and a president who you're not sure about the structure and who's actually in charge. And I think when you look at it, I think about this with all of these coaches. And I know we're talking about Mike Vrabel, but I'm going to shift the conversation briefly because I was having a conversation with someone this week and I was asking them, what do you think Mike McCarthy and the Cowboys are going to do? Because as we've talked about extensively on this show, Mike McCarthy's on the final year of his contract. So the Cowboys and Mike McCarthy each have a decision to make of whether they want to continue this relationship. This is not the type of thing that they have to make a decision to split, but not a decision to keep moving forward together. They need a new contract. And then someone was trying to convince me, and I can't say I was totally convinced, that Mike McCarthy would rather coach the New Orleans Saints in 2025 than the Dallas Cowboys. And while I can understand how that would be a conversation that comes up in the rhetoric, to me, I'm wondering, oh, well, if you don't know if you're going to have an opportunity to coach the Cowboys in 2025, it makes sense to start saying, hey, maybe the Saints. If you've also coached the Saints as an offensive coordinator in the past. But when I look at it, and I was like, this person was trying to convince me that the Cowboys structure with Jerry Jones was so unappealing that, like, oh, the Saints don't have that same ownership structure. Look, first of all, Mike McCarthy is one of the best coaches I've seen. I mean, Jason Garrett might be up there too, of willingness and ability to deal with Jerry Jones and be unfazed by it. Like, he's like got that Pittsburgh mentality, like, all right, cool, you say that, I'll deal with what I'm dealing with. But even forgetting that, this is not like ownership only. When I look at the talent on the Cowboys roster and the talent on the Saints roster, it's not comparable right now. And so I was not convinced. And so my thing is like, okay, the Jets. Well, if the Jets have a worse ownership structure than the Giants, but the Giants have less talent, and I will say, I think the Giants have more talent than is being used, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, which Mike Vrabel would be able to take and really capitalize on. But I think, I mean, what if one team has ownership and one team has talent? Then what do you do?
By the way, we're as you go through all these teams, you're right. Like which of these job openings is appealing? Like the Saints?
Yeah, this is how Bill Belichick ends up at North Carolina.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, you really think about these jobs. You're right. Like I'm sitting here trashing the Jets, but are the Saints any better with their salary cap issues and lack of talent and aging talent? The Cowboys any better with their clown show? Everybody coming through the star every day. Is it? You go. There's a reason. The Bears, Kevin Warren, that whole situation, and you're right. All of these openings, the ones that we anticipate anyway, there's a drawback to each and every one. There's a reason these teams are looking for new head coaches, and it's probably not just the fired head coach's fault.
Right, like Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner, regardless of quarterback, that to me is just a better situation than like the Giants from a talent standpoint.
But let's give the Jets a little bit of credit here, at least for the fact that if Vrabel is their guy, they got there first. Like, according to C-Rob, we've talked about it on the show. The Bears seem to internally have a lot of interest in Vrabel because of his ability to pinpoint a good offensive coordinator hire. We talked about that on Inside Coverage not that long ago. The Bears are under the same exact situation the Jets are under. They could bring him in. They didn't. They didn't get there first. Like, as bad as the Jets might be, if they've identified somebody, and certainly they still have to go through the Rooney Rule, whatever that's going to mean, but if they've identified somebody that they think is the top prospect and they brought him in first, I at least got to give them a tip of the cap for that, because certainly if the Bears are very interested in Vrabel, my question is, why weren't you calling at midnight? Like, the minute you could, why weren't you making that phone call? Why weren't you lining up that visit? Like, bring him into Chicago, show off your facilities, let him meet Caleb Williams, show off your dudes. Like, the Bears didn't do the very thing that the Jets have at least done. So yes, all of these openings have a little bit of a sense of helplessness, hopelessness to them. But I also do look at it and say, all you can do is look at it and say, next foot forward, we're going to be our best foot. And the Jets are trying to do that right now, which was one more than I can say about Chicago, who's sitting there letting supposedly one of their top candidates be interviewed by somebody else without being first to the punch. I'll pose this to the room. If you love Ben Johnson, but you're aware that just the opportunity to interview Ben Johnson may have to wait all the way until we get close to the Super Bowl, and you know that he's turned down a job in recent memory, are you willing, if you also love Vrabel, are you willing to be completely out of the Mike Vrabel sweepstakes on the if-come that possibly Ben Johnson not only is going to interview, be a great fit, and then also choose your job this time?
And that's why, this is why the NFL needs to change this. I've always hated this whole, interviewing coaches during the playoffs and all that. Like, what's the problem with just moving this back? Like, I get it.
Which they did move it back a little bit. It'll be interesting to see if they do it the full way, but they did move it back to, after the wild card round, and you can only do virtual at first. And this and
it's almost like the college football transfer portal. Like, what are we doing? Like, can't we just set a date after the season? Like, is it that hard? So I get it. But yes, to answer the question, do you want to wait for the guy who might not, the bird in hand type of deal here? I don't know the answer to that. I think that it's worth it if you really are sold that Ben Johnson is the next superstar coach in the NFL. But you gotta kind of dance with other options, right? Like, it's hard because of this whole. You're right. The whole situation makes it difficult, and that's why the system's a little bit screwed up, and it, I think, penalizes coordinators of really, really good teams sometimes that don't get the option. But look, I mean, in the system that's in place, if I'm the Bears, I want to talk to everybody. I want to at least get a feel for, hey, can we get Ben Johnson, who has been the best play caller in the NFL for the last couple of years? I think you owe it to yourself to at least see that through.
I've also evolved in what I think is the right fit for Ben Johnson, because I think when we ask ourselves, okay, how do we know what he's going to be like as a head coach? There have been coordinators in the past who have excelled at coordinator, but not as head coach. And that's not necessarily a knock on Ben Johnson. That's just looking at the history of people who have taken the jump that he seems about to be taking. And I think when I look at it, a few months ago, I would have told you, and I know I keep coming back to the Cowboys, but I would have told you Mike McCarthy is not going to return. Get a Mike Vrabel type who can kind of toughen up this team, because they were having those crazy losses to the Saints and the Ravens and the Lions. Then I evolved to, okay, well, maybe you're not sure that Mike Vrabel is going to be significantly better than Mike McCarthy, given that he had that late stretch, even when they were injured. There's been a lot going on this year, et cetera, et cetera. Recently, I've kind of started to think that the Cowboys don't necessarily need that leader of men, so to say, which, again, I'm not saying Ben Johnson isn't, but that's not the main thing he is hailed for, because they have someone in Dak who is absolutely praised across the league as one of the best leaders in the league. Not necessarily one of the best players, but one of the best leaders in the league. And so I think that if you bring in a Ben Johnson type who can elevate the type of ideas and the scheme and all of that for a clearly very talented group of offensive players, you might not need that, compared to, in Chicago, you might really need someone who already has that experience and like skins on the wall of being able to lead guys and manage an organization. So I think it's interesting when you think about what that best fit will be for Ben Johnson, because maybe with the veteran leadership group, he might not need to do as much of that.
I also don't love the thought. I mean, this is just a deeper thought on Ben Johnson. If we got to wait all the way to the Super Bowl, it means Ben Johnson is near the end of getting his pick of coordinators. He's near the end of building his staff, like all of these things for a first-time head coach. I find that stuff to be significant. And I also wonder, to the point of anyone that wants to interview Ben Johnson, if you're Mike Vrabel, the last hiring cycle passed you over. For whatever reason, the last hiring cycle didn't want you. So if you're Vrabel and somebody brings you in to interview you, are you even going to be willing to sit around while they also figure out if they want Ben Johnson? Like, this is a little bit of like, if you want it, you should put a ring on it. You know, if I'm Vrabel, I want somebody to love me as much as I love them, because the last hiring cycle didn't give me a job. And what I don't want to do is sit there and say, well, I'm going to pass on the Jets for the Bears, but I'm going to let the Bears talk to Ben Johnson first. Like, bird in the hand has to matter to Vrabel, because he spent the last year as a consultant for the Browns. You can't tell me that's how Vrabel saw this last season go. I just can't believe that.
The counter argument to that is that the coach who seemed most like the second option last year was Dan Quinn with the Commanders, after they wanted Ben Johnson. And that's been one of the most successful coach team fits of this year. And so I don't know. I think you have to ask yourself that. But there was a great story in The Athletic that came out, I believe it was today, by Zach Rosenblatt, who spent a lot of time with Mike Vrabel over the last 6 months. And they really handled pretty honestly this idea of like, hey, he criticized players a lot and really gave them a hard look at what they were doing wrong, not just what they were doing right. Hey, he wanted to have a pretty significant degree of personnel control. I mean, he comes from those Belichick ways, trying to be involved with the inactives, be involved with the draft, all of that. And it really talked about, hey, well, what's the difference between a different opinion and disagreement and dissent and kind of like discord? And so I think that is one of the things that it was pretty clear to me from that story. Vrabel is aware of that. I don't know if reputation is probably a strong word, but he was aware of that conversation going on and really trying to explain through his work with the Browns how he learned and how they learned about his ability to collaborate.
Yeah, the collaboration element of this is, it's just interesting, because if you're Vrabel, you're going to get a second chance. And I would argue, knowing the Titans organization and that fan base pretty well, I would argue that he got a pretty good first chance at a job that doesn't necessarily have the same level of scrutiny other jobs in the NFL does. Like, Frank and I have talked on Sunday nights repeatedly about whether or not Callahan has shown enough to come back another year for the Titans. You can be a bad football team with the Titans, and the fan base will yell and scream, but it's not the same. It doesn't resonate the same way that when you stink and you're the Bears coach, or you're the Jets coach, or you're the Cowboys coach. Like, there's a different magnifying glass on everything that you do when you're the coach of a higher profile team. I am genuinely curious to see how Vrabel approaches his second opportunity, because he walked out of the breakup between he and the Titans, let's call it that, with a lot of street cred. It seems like everybody looked at it and said, well, it's not Vrabel, it's the Titans. I don't know that he gets that same grace. So I do think that if you're Vrabel, there's a fine line between, hey, I want a job and I want someplace that loves me versus I want a job that will absolutely let me shine because this is my second chance, and getting a third chance is really difficult to do. Like you mentioned, Dan Quinn is a great example, Jori, of somebody that we talked about on this show. Was pretty selective in what he wanted and how he wanted to do it, right? And I do think that there's an element of Vrabel. I'll be interested to see if the next step for him, if he's careful and cautious to make sure that it represents him the best way, because he walked out of that split with the Titans unscathed, which is rare for a coach that gets fired.
Can I tell you, though, love just feels like the wrong word to me. I don't think that Vrabel is the type who wants someone to love him. I think Vrabel is the type who wants someone to give him the responsibility and the opportunity and the leeway to set his culture and have the influence on the organization that he believes will best allow him to have that touch. I mean, Belichick, too. Belichick wanted the responsibility and the control, not the love. And so I think that when you think about Vrabel, and when I was reading this article from The Athletic about how he believes that conflict is healthy, which is a big Mike McCarthy thing and all of that, I really, again, and I know I get what you're saying, but I think that it's not about, is he their first choice? It's about, can he run the organization in the way that is best tailored to what he believes is his vision for the team, which again is ultimately why Belichick is not in the NFL, because Belichick and others knew that telling Belichick, and obviously he has a different level of success and Super Bowl success than Vrabel has, so I'm not comparing them on that regard, just in terms of the way that they view the head coach's role in this league. But to tell these guys, hey, you got to do it a different way, doesn't always work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important because you talk about Vrabel. Why did it fail in Tennessee? Well, we've all heard there's a lot of power struggle between him, ownership, and the front office.
Oh my gosh. C-Rob had his whole thing about when they were drafting Will Levis in the video analysis. Continue.
And so, yes, I think that's a huge for him. But to Fitz's point, you better get this right because, yeah, he might have got out unscathed from Tennessee and everybody still thinks of him as a really, really good coach, which is rare. If you go to the Saints and you go, whatever it is, 5-23 over 2 years or whatever the math ends up being, you're probably not getting a third shot. Like you got to get this right. You got to get in a good situation. And there aren't many good situations out there. You're going to have to kind of make chicken salad, right? So it's very important for Mike Vrabel to make the right choice. Not these teams really, but Mike Vrabel to make the right choice to get a good second opportunity because third opportunities don't really come along that often.
Well, and Frank, to that point, think about this for a second. For everything that Vrabel accomplished at Tennessee, and look, it wasn't Super Bowls, but he won a lot of games there. He never really had a quarterback, right? Like he never really had a guy that we've got our franchise guy. Like Ryan Tannehill was not going to sit here and make anybody mistake him for, a franchise legend, right? So as much as we talk about Vrabel wants a place where he can integrate his culture, he wants a place where he can have, I don't want to say control, but he knows how everything's going to be run. I also think it would be smart of Vrabel to want to go somewhere that has a clear path to a quarterback. Advantage against Chicago. If he likes Caleb Williams, you start looking at some of the openings here. The Saints are stuck at the quarterback position right now with a ton of money to Derek Carr and no real plan for what's going to be next unless you suddenly love Spencer Rattler. The Jets have no idea what the future of quarterback looks like. The Giants may or may not be picking high enough to get a quarterback. Everybody wants to put Vrabel to the Raiders.
How much less attractive a job is the Giants now than it was a week ago?
Wow, that's a great question. It has to be, right? Like, it has to be. Because you don't know. Yeah, they have no idea if they're going to get... I assume Tennessee's drafting a quarterback at 2. And all of a sudden, the Giants are like, you might have to... maybe you got to pay to move up. But yes, if you don't have any hope at quarterback... We overrate that a little bit, I think, with coaches. Like, that's the first thing we talk about. Like, there's a lot of other things that go along with being a head coach. Like, stuff we'd never talk about. Like, maybe Mike Vrabel just doesn't want to live in Chicago. Maybe, maybe he likes New York. Like that I don't know. Like,
Frank,
stuff like that.
This is where I put the only reason I pushed back when I was just in the music world still. I remember I was playing, the band was playing an event at the Grand Ole Opry, and we were at the Opry House. It was like a private event for a company, and Herm Edwards was the speaker, and he did this great, Herm did this speech. I'm telling you, Herm had everybody running through walls, and it was basically, you got to make sure everybody on the team understands their role and they feel empowered on their role, because even if you have Tom Brady can't be Tom Brady unless the guys in front of him block for him, and it was just great speech. So I'm talking to Herm afterward for a while, because I was backstage in my Raiders hoodie as always, and he's like, Raiders fan. So Herm being Herm sits down and talks to me for like an hour. And the number of times in that hour he said, let me tell you something, son, He said, let me tell you something, son. If you don't have a quarterback, you can't be a coach. If you have a quarterback, suddenly you're a brilliant coach. But you don't have one, suddenly you don't know what you're doing. I just think when you're a second-time head coach looking around and saying, okay, I understand what the quarterback situation looks like. I think that has to be huge. Like, you can dislike Kevin Warren. You can get Kevin Warren fired. There are a lot of different Kevin Warrens out there. Go send Kevin Warren on his way. Bring somebody else in. There are not a lot of Caleb Williams. There, especially when you start talking about these other openings and who's out there. Like, would you rather have Caleb Williams or would you rather have Aiden O'Connell as your quarterback next year? These are real decisions he's got to make.
And Fitz, look at last year, Jim Harbaugh. He's a smart guy, right? He's like, that Chargers job. I got Justin Herbert. Yeah, let's do that. And then he's already back in the playoffs. We're talking about him being a genius again. Like that there is something to be said about it.
Even better than Caleb Williams is there are people who have worked with Mike Vrabel in the past who think that Jacksonville is going to be a really attractive job to him because you don't have some of the spotlight and the criticism. The owner might let you do what you want. You might let you bring in the GM you want. And, oh, by the way, you have Trevor Lawrence, who has really proven more, in my opinion, than Caleb Williams in the NFL. I understand that he hasn't had the career right away that everyone wants him to, but I think in terms of the way he works with his team and the way he's developed as a passer, people would be more willing to bank on Trevor Lawrence in the next 3 to 5 years than they would with Caleb Williams.
Jori, you're blowing my mind here because you're right. Think about, like, Tennessee, again, a little bit invisible sometimes as a franchise. So when they stink, people aren't yelling and screaming about it the same way. Sorry, Titans fans. Jags, the same way. You go out and you win a couple of games for the Jags, and if you go out and it's a disaster, the first thing that we're all going to think is, man, the Khan family just stinks at this. They stink at owning a football team. Like, the first thing, we're not going to sit there and immediately think, oh, that guy can't coach. Like, at some point, this makes a ton of sense. And because we all know that Shad Khan seems as an owner to be very unengaged, right? Like, he's not really part of what's happening every day there. He's just if you're Vrabel, you just get to fly. You're going to do what you want to do. Like,
and you have Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, you're blowing my mind.
Just fine. Yeah, and you're right about Caleb.
The only thing you have to ask yourself, though, is who is Mike Vrabel going to bring as offensive coordinator? Because I think one of the knocks on Doug Peterson is his commitment to Press Taylor, even when that offense hasn't been working. And so you really need to have that guy figured out, or that woman, but there's probably not a woman who's already in the pipeline. Also,
by the way, you get yourself into a division that looks a lot more winnable to, like, if we're talking about winnable divisions and job openings, going out there in the East, AFC East, you got to figure out how to take down Buffalo. If you're talking about Chicago, you're in I wouldn't want to have anything to do with that division. If we're talking about the Raiders job, Vrabel's been speculated with, you got to take on Mahomes and Herbert and Reed and, Harbaugh, the list goes on and on. You take that Jags job, all right, Houston?
But Fitz, I don't even think you realize another element of that you're making me think of, which is that he was in the AFC South already. So Mike Vrabel knows that division backward and forward. He coached the Titans. Look, like you said, I don't think he has to really worry about the Colts right now. I don't think he has to really worry about the Titans. And, oh, by the way, the Texans, if you can beat the Texans, how great is ownership going to feel if C.J. Stroud was the darling of the NFL 2 years ago? D'Amico Ryan's there, the story of the team that turned it around really quickly. If you can beat them in the division, I mean, easy way to earn street cred real soon.
I'm calling it now. Vrabel to the Jags. We've decided on I cannot believe.
You are so easily convinced.
Vrabel to the Jags.
It says something, and 2 minutes later, you are 100% on board. But it makes sense.
Frank, you're the one who is sure about Brandon Ayuk. I don't know why I keep coming back to that, but I still really, I think because you really made me question that Brandon Ayuk was leaving, and so I just really am still processing that.
It didn't make, I did not think the San Francisco 49ers would be that unprofessional, but whatever. That's a story for 4 months ago,
and for 4 months from now. By the way, before we get off the coaching train, McCarthy, Dallas or somewhere else, the real question to me is, Jori, you mentioned McCarthy a minute ago. Is he just laying the foundation to be somewhere else? And if so, is he somewhere else next year in your mind?
It's fascinating. I was asking someone last night in the league, I'm like, do you expect Mike McCarthy or Aaron Rodgers to be in the NFL later? Because, again, I'm going to the Jets game this weekend, and we're not sure if it's Aaron Rodgers' last game. I still think there's a whole, he wants to get the attention as if it's his last game, but then maybe come back.
He's done that before.
Yeah, the person told me that they expect Mike McCarthy because, again, you also could say, what if Mike McCarthy wants to retire? Not because he's not capable of being a good coach anymore. I still think he's a good coach. I don't think he's the best coach in the league right now, but I still think he's a good coach, both in terms of how he manages the organization and how he calls plays. I mean, again, both what he did with Dak last year, and he really did improve the offense in its first year when he took over, and also what he did with Cooper Rush in that offense to win 4 out of 5. That said, you still have to ask yourself, I don't know, like, does he want to start over again? Does he want to go to New Orleans? Does he want to move his kids again? I'm just not sure that makes a lot of sense. But with Dallas also, if you don't really feel like you can get one of the top candidates, what's your creative hire that you think is going to be so much better than Mike McCarthy? Like Frank and Fitz, who are you hiring for 2025 if you're Dallas that you think you can both actually get and will be a better option than Mike McCarthy?
And that's the thing. I don't think there's a great cycle. Like last year, there was a lot of good coaching hires and guys who you were like, oh yeah, like Dan Quinn, he's been in demand for a long time, and Jim Harbaugh is coming back. Okay, and it seemed kind of to deplete the pool, because I look at all the teams that have openings now, and I'm like, there's not a lot of like slam dunk. Like I'd be really excited to hire this guy type of guys. Like, yes, you got your Joe Brady's, and yes, but like, yeah, I mean, guys like Bobby Slowick. Bobby Slowick has not had a good year. Like 6 months ago, we were all talking about him being the next Ben Johnson, basically, the same way we talked about Bobby Slowick. Well, Slowick didn't have a very good season with the Houston Texans, I'll tell you that. So, the stars dim for him a little bit. And you're right, like, the Cowboys let McCarthy go. I always say this about quarterbacks, because every team's fan base wants to cut their quarterback, right? Like, oh, let's get rid of this quarterback. Okay, cool. You got rid of your quarterback. Who's your week 1 starter? And that's a tough question to answer. And if the Cowboys do dump Mike McCarthy, or, because the contract is up, I don't know. Like, I don't know the counterpunch. I don't know what answer you could have where you're like, yes, that guy is definitely better than Mike McCarthy, who's won 61% of his games and a Super Bowl ring in his career.
Yeah, I will say this. If you tell me they're getting a Ben Johnson, I understand it. The one thing I don't think would make any sense for the Cowboys is to bring in somebody that isn't a quarterback whisperer, because you put the money that you put into Dak at this point. So bringing in somebody that's going to bring in somebody to work with the quarterback, I don't want that. I want somebody that comes in and from day one, I mean, as part of the interview, whoever I'm bringing in to replace McCarthy is sitting in the room with Dak, and I'm making sure the two of them, they get along, that they have a connection, that they see things the same, that they can speak a common language, because once the money's invested, it's so hard to get out of it. And Jori, the other thing that I'll just quickly say about McCarthy that I never want to spend a rich man's money. Somebody that's worth a lot told me a long time ago that one of the biggest mistakes we could all make in life is spending a rich person's money, because they got rich for a reason. Mike McCarthy is really rich. I don't know how much money he's got in the bank. We're not on that level, but he's been coaching in the NFL long enough that his career earnings have to be, 50, 60, $70 million. Just ask everybody listening right now, would you want to put up with Jerry Jones if you were worth $70 million? That's just the one thing that I
really don't think it bothers him as much as you guys think it does.
And maybe it doesn't.
It's like Jerry's just Jerry.
Jerry
I think at
is
some point
intensely loyal
whatever.
to the people who works with him. I'm not saying that he doesn't do a lot of things, but I'm telling you, the people who work for Jerry Jones really like working for Jerry Jones. They appreciate how it's a family business where his 3 kids are around all the time, his grandkids, all of that. Like, it is not as bad to work for Jerry Jones as people are making it out.
So let me rephrase it then. Would you want to deal with the just pile of dung that comes with being the Cowboys coach? However we want to term that. Like, you want to deal with all of that.
I don't like that term either. How many times do I have to tell you we don't need to turn everything into poop on the show?
Well, I mean, I haven't used a poop reference in weeks.
I know. I thought we were really improving, and now we're back to it to start out.
I'm just saying, like,
no, but I do think you guys make a good point of there are different things that have to be considered. And the other thing is, when you hire a new coach, the way someone put it to me recently in the league is that it's not just about finding a coach that you believe is better than the one that you're getting rid of. It's also that the coach is so much better that they are able to overcome the adjustment period, because you're having to blow everything up and you're having to shake things up for the players. Now, I think that can go both ways, because I do believe there's a counter argument about getting a fresh voice in the building. But I think that the fresh voice in the building is different if you're like Caleb Williams, where he's going to the second year of his rookie deal, compared to a team that already is like fairly veteran, a lot of guys making a lot of money, and you're in a different stage of your team life cycle. But also on that same note of, can you find that next guy? That's why I think that this coaching cycle is very different than last year, because when we compare Mike Vrabel to Dan Quinn, well, Dan Quinn was taking a job in a year that was a great year to get a quarterback. In fact, it seems like it's going to end up being a great year to get 5 or 6 quarterbacks really high. This is not that year. So if you're going to the Giants, for example, I'm saying like, or the Raiders, like you're not sure you're going to get that guy. And certainly not that you're going to get him early. And let's say, great, like you get the next Sam Darnold and he figures it out eventually. Well, that doesn't save your job.
Sure, you're right. And by the way, for our bosses that are listening right now, I mean, like, look, if you want to pay me what an NFL coach makes, you can come up and kick me in the no-no places every day for the rest of my life. Like, for that much money per year, there's nothing I wouldn't handle.
Like HR would have questions about that, right?
No, I mean, but just put it in the contract, and then all of a sudden it's fine. It's like, hey, item 27 says that Ryan Spoon, Sam Farber, or Matt Uffer can come up and just kick me in the you-knows once a day, just once a day, every day for the existence of my contract.
This is why I try and stay on the Wednesday show, to be clear.
The Wednesday show is far less reckless than the Friday show. Pro Bowl rosters were announced. We'll get to some snubs there, plus what to do with Saquon, but we're going to take a quick break first.
Introducing Daily Draw, the latest free-to-play game from Yahoo Sports. Daily Draw gives you a pack of 6 prediction cards every day based on the day's biggest sporting event. Download or update the Yahoo Sports app on the Apple App Store or Google Play and join the action with Daily Draw today.
Pro Bowl rosters were announced. I will say snubs on Pro Bowl rosters make a lot of people roll their eyes. It does make a financial difference to players. Real quick, I just want to make sure we point that out. That contracts have these worked in. Values on contracts on rookie deals account for Pro Bowl. So, like, Jori, I don't want to just gloss over Pro Bowl snubs because there's financial ramifications.
Oh, let's just say I was working on an article this season, and when I talked to a high-ranking front office executive for it, they show up to our conversation and they go, how much more am I going to have to pay this guy after you write this story? And I'm like, oh, okay. Because I'm like, okay, Pro Bowl, all pro, all these things, it makes a difference. So, yes, it absolutely makes a difference, especially if you're not already established in winning Super Bowls. And these things are highly used by agents, which is also one of the interesting things because there's a belief in the league, specifically with the Pro Bowl. Maybe the All Pro too, but the Pro Bowl and All Pro have different voting processes that once you've made it to a Pro Bowl, it's easier to make it to another Pro Bowl because this is voting by coaches, players, and fans. And so your name gets on people's radar and then they vote for you again. And also it's like, okay, like there's a string, and David Mulligetta is an agent who has like fantastic clients. So I'm not saying they weren't deserving of it, but like Jalen Ramsey, Derwin James, all these guys who are all teammates and rep by the same agent and felt like a family would vote for each other and drum up support for each other. And it definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, very flawed process. But, and this might be one and the same with the story you were telling, but Zach Bond made the Pro Bowl and he was talking yesterday to the Philadelphia media and said, well, they put that Pro Bowl incentive in my contract. I was like, laughed. Like, what?
Oh, I didn't know he had that incentive in his contract.
Yeah. He had $500,000 for Zach Bond making the Pro Bowl. And when they put it in as your story, great story, by the way, go back and read that if you haven't on Zach Bond on Wisconsin, that he was like, they put the $500,000 to make the Pro Bowl, and Zach Bond, a career special teamer to this point, was like, ha, that's funny. Sure, whatever. And lo and behold, he has an unbelievable year and makes $500,000. So to Fitz's point, this is, even though this process is beyond flawed for the Pro Bowl, it does matter for a lot of guys in their pocketbook.
No, that is a great point, Frank. And I know that I haven't been on the show since that story came out, but that was one of the things that Zach told me also, which is that when I asked him what he was expecting in free agency last year, he literally said, I started looking at the history of special teamer contracts and was hoping to get one of the better contracts in terms of the range of special teamers. And now he's PFF's highest rated inside linebacker this year, despite the fact that he's never played off-ball linebacker.
And he'll get some Defensive Player of the Year votes. Speaking of why, by the way, I know we're on Pro Bowl, but Patrick Surtain taken over as Defensive Player of the Year. I did have to take a little bit of a victory lap because me and Fitz, we've been talking about that since like early October. That Patrick Surtain deserves to be Defensive Player of the Year. He has taken over as a favorite over TJ Watt. I felt a little bit vindicated because quarterbacks never get that kind of attention. It's just kind of, well, who has the most sacks? That's fine. Let's go. And then Patrick Surtain just has this unbelievable year. I hope he wins Defensive Player of the Year. He deserves it. There's my tangent for the day, Fitz. Go ahead.
All right. So I like your tangents. Biggest snubs. Give me a couple of names that stood out to you.
For me, it's Brian Thomas. And it's unbelievable to me that Zay Flowers and Jerry Jeudy made it ahead of Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas has more yards than either of those guys and more touchdowns than those two guys combined. Like, that's the thing about Pro Bowl snubs. So real quick, when we talk about, oh, this guy got snubbed, I always want to ask, well, who do you take off? Because, they always do this.
You did a good job of framing that in your article.
And
really good.
And college basketball does this all the time, where if you listen to a lot of analysts, that if you add up all the teams that should be in a tournament, it adds up like 170, right? Like you're like, no. If you're telling me that like Wake Forest needs to be in the tournament, you need to take somebody out. And so we talk about Baker Mayfield being a snub, and I wrote about that even because I think he's having a great year. But do you take out Goff? Do you take out Darnold? Like, I mean, you have Jaden Daniels was the third guy. Who do you take out from there? Well, Brian Thomas, I have two answers. Jerry Jeudy didn't deserve to make it ahead of him. Zay Flowers, I was stunned, made it. He's been really up and down this year. A good player by all means, but Brian Thomas, by far to me, was the biggest snub of any of the Pro Bowlers.
I mean, to me, the biggest snub, so I have to put in my all-pro votes by Monday. And I think that there's this idea of what happened this season, who is the most valuable player, and not letting previous seasons impact how you vote. So I don't believe that because Tyron Smith was a great left tackle for 10 years that he should be on the ballot this year when he has not been one of the best left tackles. But when I look at Patrick Mahomes, who, by the way, you might say, well, Patrick Mahomes, like the Chiefs always struggle more in the regular season than the playoffs. He must not have had Pro Bowls every year. He had 6 straight Pro Bowl berths. This was the first year since he started in the NFL that he didn't make the Pro Bowl. And while I understand that statistically he wasn't Joe Burrow, he wasn't Josh Allen, and he wasn't Lamar Jackson, and so I do think you have such a stacked group of quarterbacks in that conference. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have made him, but if you told me you could start my team with one of those quarterbacks, are you for sure taking one of those over Patrick Mahomes? And also, I'm not even saying who you want in 2026. I'm saying for this season, who do you want more? I do think that, again, Lamar Jackson, look at the talent he had around him compared to Patrick Mahomes. The other guys I will say were elevating, although Joe Burrow, and again, Joe Burrow's had an incredible year and deserves the accolades he's been getting, but he did have T. Higgins and Jamar Chase there, which is not what Patrick Mahomes was working with in terms of his targets. And so when I look at it, I think that while we shouldn't take past performance into account, we should take current ability to elevate team into account for these awards. And I think Patrick Mahomes can still elevate those teams more. And so it's interesting when you leave him off of that list.
Yeah, I hear that. I think the toughest part about that is everybody that listens to that clip is going to turn around and be like, oh, you haven't watched. Like, the toughest part of that is that it hasn't looked like easy. And I that's such a cliche way to say that. But like, there's just you watch it and you think, man, I don't know. Like when I watch Baker, every single game, I feel like I watch Baker. I'm like, golly, this is so amazing. And then you watch Patrick Mahomes, you're like, how the hell did he win that game? And there's a testament to being able to win that game. But I also look at it and think, God, without knowing who I would take off in place, maybe Jaden Daniels, I don't know. But like what Baker Mayfield has done this year to me has been really incredible. And I don't know the right way to recognize that.
I was really surprised Jaden Daniels made it.
Really? I think Jaden Daniels is closer to MVP votes than he is to being left off the Pro Bowl. Like, he's done when you look at that Washington team that's going to the playoffs, Jaden Daniels has lifted everybody. That's not a good roster. There's still so much work for them to do. It's one dude who's like put the whole franchise on his shoulders as a rookie and taken them to the playoffs. So I thought Jaden was justified. But here, the thing about Baker is, we talked about this on Sunday night, that 39 touchdowns. I was like, wow, he's got 39 touchdowns. Then you start thinking about the Buccaneers season. He hasn't had Chris Godwin for half the season. He didn't have Mike Evans for 5 games? Something like that. Like, it's pretty impressive what Baker's doing. That was a tough vote. Like, I don't think Mahomes, I put Mahomes on the Pro Bowl snub just because it seems weird that a 15-1 Chiefs team with Patrick Mahomes all year, that he didn't make the Pro Bowl, but I can't kick any of those 3 guys out. Like, Lamar's about ready to set the single-season passer rating record. Josh Allen probably is going to win MVP. He's the betting favorite right now. Joe Burrow has had an unbelievable year. I can't kick any of those 3 guys out. Like, those were the 3 right guys. But when you talk about Baker,
if I told you get one quarterback for your franchise, who are you taking right now?
I'm taking Mahomes. And there's no doubt about it. Like, I'd take him over any of those 3 guys. And there's no question. But I think this year, the results have been the results. And I don't think Mahomes has been on the level of those 3 guys. Like, a team record-wise, yeah, sure. For no doubt about that. But I think that those were the 3 AFC Pro Bowl quarterbacks. And it's weird that Patrick Mahomes wasn't on there. Yeah. But I think it's the right call.
And it's also just so fascinating to me that last year the Chiefs went 11-6 and Mahomes was on it, and now they're 15-1 and he's not. And I get that he's not their only part of their team and that their defense has been fantastic this year. And so I'm not what Fitz.
They're 15-1. It's just Like,
I was like, what am I saying? That's so crazy.
No, what you
well,
said is so brilliant.
That last year, they were struggling on offense and they were 11-6. So to me, the question is, and this is one of my, like, I feel like I'm an old lady when I say this. This is one of my gripes with.
You're so old, yeah.
No, this is one of my gripes with like the red zone and the highlight and all of this culture that we've created is that when you watch red zone, again, I watch red zone regularly. When you watch it, you think that that is what football is supposed to be. And you think that that is how every play is going. And then you go back and watch your team's full game and you're like, wait, what? They went 3 and out on that play? But like, how is Josh Allen going 3 and out? Or how are they not converting on this? Or how are they missing that? How are the quarterback and receiver on the same page? Or not on the same page, I should say. And then you realize that the highlights are not the only part of the game. And so I think to me, yes, Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen and all that have had way more highlights than Patrick Mahomes, but ultimately, which quarterback is going to win you more games? And so are you saying that this award is for someone who is more skilled and giving you more things to be entertained by? Again, Fitz, you were saying it doesn't look easy, it doesn't look pretty, all of that. Is it better entertainment or more ability to win a game? Because I can guarantee you, and I know that the Chiefs defense has been fantastic and that there are games when Mahomes against the 49ers had all these interceptions, all of that, but he figured out how to win the game at the end. And I can tell you that that's the stat he most wants.
Yeah. And by the way, welcome to Frank and I have talked a lot about both of our disdain for red zone. Like, red zone is fun if you just want a video game in the background, but I just can't do it. Like, there's a reason why I sit there with 8 TVs in front of me. Like, there's a reason why Mondays I spend all day rewatching the games, because like it's the only way to try and figure it. Like, I think Jori, what you just said is such an important part of how we consume football now has turned into red zone, and therefore how we view certain players is all about the group of 8 to 10 highlights that we saw on Sunday, and has very little to do with the actual game. And because we are in a fantasy football world that rules so much of it's how Yahoo makes our money, right? Like, gambling and fantasy football, we'll walk into it and say, well, I had the over on yards and this guy scored more points than projected, so he must have been great today. And then you're like, well, actually, like, Mahomes underperforming as a fantasy football quarterback changes some of the narrative that people want to have about Mahomes. And the reality of it is they're 15-1. I can never remember in my lifetime seeing a 15-1 football team be constantly questioned the way we question the Chiefs. We try and paint the picture that they're broken every week, and they're 15-1. My God.
There's never been a 15-1 football team like this that has the point differential. They have the lowest point differential.
Yeah, but if they figure out how to win, unless you truly believe the NFL is scripted, that's my thing. Think about what Patrick Mahomes is playing with on offense compared to what Joe Burrow is playing with on offense. And which one are you going to say? If you put Patrick Mahomes in the Bengals offense or Joe Burrow in the Chiefs offense, which would you rather have in each offense? So to be clear,
Jori, you would take Burrow off and put Mahomes on? Those are your three?
Allen, I think
Jackson,
so, and I think
Mahomes.
the other thing that you have to,
that's fine.
I think that the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that these votes are all done before the end of the season because the NFL wants the Pro Bowl to come out. So, for example, my All-Pro ballot is due the day after the regular season.
All-Pro is so much better than Pro Bowl. And people think it's the same and they just interchange them. All-Pro is such a better, it is way, way better. The voting process is better. It's not 3. It's 1 quarterback. Who's your 1 quarterback on your All-Pro team?
It's also not NFC versus AFC. So, like, I'm not convinced Jaden Daniels is having, again, this is also going back to the Coach of the Year question, which is Andy Reid's not going to win Coach of the Year, but he's the 15-1 team. And so is this most exceeding our expectations, most entertaining us to watch, or the person who is the most valuable? And I don't think it's necessarily wrong to mix it up with guys. If anything, my biggest gripe with the awards process this year is that they changed Comeback Player of the Year's definition after last year, which, again, I voted for Joe Flacco over Damar Hamlin. I stand by that decision.
It was Tua.
Because I know, yes, you're very pro Tua, and I stand by that decision because this was a football award in terms of what they came back to do on the football field. And so I believe that someone who was out of the game and then had the best performance deserved, it was like the most improved of people who weren't playing. But then this year, and arguably the year of the comeback quarterback, was Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield. And I know Geno, it's not his best year, but he's still having that same sort of process. We now have to vote for a comeback player of the year who had some sort of illness or other extenuating circumstances that kept them off the field last year. And I'm like doing my research. Did Sam Darnold get hurt? And that is a factor in how he ended up the San Francisco 49ers backup such that I could vote for him. But it's like, no, you probably got to get for like a J.K. Dobbins type because they were actually injured.
Yeah, it's always like...
Joe Burrow actually is probably the best.
He's going to run away with it. But yeah, it's always like, well, was it the worst injury or was it just some guy who was injured who had the best season? Comeback player of the year.
The closest one to dying. That's what people wanted.
They should just start a second award.
Yeah.
They should have the Comeback Player of the Year award, and then they should have the DeMar Hamlin award every year for somebody that went through something tragic and got back on the
worst adversity. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, there's a lot of I have a problem with a lot of the voting criteria of across. We could argue about this a long time, but yes, Comeback Player of the Year is weird. Coach of the Year is weird. I can't wait. Once we can talk about this. I know, Jori, you're a voter. You can't talk about it, right? Like you can't be like, I'm voting for Lamar Jackson for MVP or whatever it is. So I can't wait to pick your brain on this because I just find the whole awards process fascinating. I think the MVP discourse has gotten terrible. Like it's bad the way we talk about MVP now. And it's become like over the last 2 weeks, it has become, well, this guy has the worst teammates, so he's the MVP. Like, why on earth are we penalizing Lamar Jackson because he has good teammates? Like that's ridiculous to me. Like, who's the best player? Who's had the best season? Like this, it's absolutely ridiculous that the argument for Josh Allen has become, well, yeah, he hasn't been as good as Lamar, but look at his teammates. They're terrible. Like, we're now all of a sudden giving him the award because the Buffalo Bills front office isn't that good? Like,
yes, no, I think ridiculous. That matters, though, because if you were saying most value to the team this year, I think the ability to elevate the guys. I mean, when I look at coaches, Kevin O'Connell, for example, how much has he elevated above expectation? Like if you say, here's what the talent should be able to do on paper, how much has the coach raised that? When you say, here's what the skill group should be able to do on paper, how much has the quarterback raised that? I do think that that's what value means.
I do, but I wish, and I've said this before, I'll say it again. There was a baseball writer in the 1920s, and I can't remember which one it was. I think he's a Chicago Tribune baseball writer. It coined the term most valuable.
Not the 2020s.
Not the 2020s, the 1920s. Coined the term
1820s, the
most valuable player.
Can you clarify?
1920s. Coined the term most valuable player. And I wish, upon all these dumb arguments, that he would have just said, I'll just name it the most outstanding player, because the discourse would be so much better. I think MVP should go to the best player. Like it should, which player defined the season, which player had the best season, which player was the best. And we get into all this like value. And again, we spent 2 weeks arguing like, well, Josh Allen's teammates stink versus Lamar Jackson's. Look at the separation these guys get. And I think it goes off the rails. And I think the wrong people win MVP because of the V in MVP that we've totally overrated, where that's just such a strange criteria for the award for me. Like if Lamar Jackson is better than Josh Allen, give the award to Lamar Jackson. And I think that we could talk like, and I think it's nebulous to talk about, well, Josh Allen has elevated his teammates more. You telling me Lamar Jackson, the greatest running quarterback of all time, who's about ready to set the single season passer rating record and has won his division, hasn't elevated his teammates this year, last year?
I do question that, because if I can't be sure that you're the best player on your own team, and again, I do think that like Lamar Jackson is better than Derrick Henry this year, but I look at that with Philadelphia is where this comes into play, is that Saquon Barkley, I think, had a serious case for MVP a few weeks ago, but then I'm like, well, is he the best player on his team? And well, if Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley and all of that, Fitz, did we lose you? I think that we have all those questions.
Fitz is just like, I'm just listening.
I'm letting mommy and daddy fight through this one.
Did you see what happened to Fitz's screen? It just like went all pink. Was that just me? Okay.
Here's
casual Friday morning hallucination. Carry on.
The best part about being in this chair is that I get to have the last word. And the most important thing to remember here is that ties are okay. I think, we're just arguing about MVP when reality is Lamar and Josh Allen are both worthy of it, and they should be co-MVPs. Also, we should have co-offensive rookies of the year, because I think as just deserving as Jaden Daniels is, so is Brock Bowers. There we go. You mentioned Saquon, and I'm just going to throw that out there. You mentioned Saquon. Jori's written about Saquon. He has the chance for the record, but it looks like he's not going to get that chance. We'll break it down, but first we're going to take a quick break. All right, Saquon needs 101 yards to break Eric Dickerson's rushing record on Sunday. Philly, no reason to play the starters. We've asked ourselves, are they going to? It doesn't look like he's going to play. I just want to say this quickly. I got to get this off my chest because somebody blew my mind with this the other day. We talk about Eric Dickerson did it in less games. And I think there's an important change here that people need to understand. Yes, Eric Dickerson did what he did in less games than Saquon would have the opportunity to play for. I would challenge you, instead of looking at games, to look at total number of carries. Because in that season, in less games, Eric Dickerson actually had about the same number of carries that Saquon has to this point. If Saquon plays another game, it won't be out of whack to where the carries are. So understanding that while we want to sit here and talk about how number of games matters, I would challenge that the way football was played in Eric Dickerson's era was so different that he got so many more carries that we need to understand that this is actually, like, this is not apples and oranges. They are truly apples and apples if you look at the number of carries instead of looking at the number of games. But Jori is not going to play. It looks like. Good call, right call? How did we get here?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And Saquon did say that Nick Sirianni, the Eagles head coach, told him he would probably not play. I think when you look at this, we were trending toward this direction when the Eagles pulled Saquon from the game in the fourth quarter with about 11 and a half minutes left, because as soon as he hit 2,000 rushing yards, they're like, all right, you're out. They let him rush 6 straight times. He got over 20 yards on that last rush. So they let him get there, and they're like, okay, we're good. The offensive line celebrated. I loved it. I wrote on this on Sunday that all the offensive linemen were talking about their conversations, and Jordan Mailata said that Landon Dickerson, that's their left guard and left tackle, were talking, and he's like, oh yeah, 48 more yards. And Jordan Mailata's like, 48 to what? Like, we're up by 27 points. And he's like, to 2K, you big dummy. And I just think that is such a fun line. But that was definitely a goal. And I think that Nick Sirianni said, hey, this is going to be something fun for the players. It's going to be fun for this offensive line, fun for Saquon. By the way, credit to Saquon and the line that they did in a game that Jalen Hurts was not playing, because the prior game against Washington, when Jalen went out with a concussion, they really struggled to run the ball. And I really wrote about how that was because what Jalen did really helped Saquon in the running game, and just the threat of Jalen as a runner. And against the Cowboys, they did not need that threat of Jalen as a runner. But I think when you look at this, you really have to say, what are your goals here? What interested me is I asked a former offensive coordinator how they would handle this. And I said, if you were the coach, what would you do? Because on one hand, if God forbid Saquon, or even if an offensive lineman gets hurt, it's not just Saquon, because you're unlikely to put Saquon out there with the backup offensive line to go chase this record. Like, what if Lane Johnson gets hurt? I mean, we have seen these splits between the Eagles games with Lane Johnson and without, and they are pretty insane in terms of the likelihood that they win. And obviously it's one and done each time in the playoffs. And so one loss and done. I think when you think about this, you have to ask yourself that. But then on the other hand, if you're a coach, you say, well, how much would it fire these guys up to be like, oh, we feel like we could run through a wall, because Saquon literally just ran through this wall to get the most rushing yards in a year. And Fitz, as you alluded to, yes, you can say Saquon would benefit from 17 games, but also Eric Dickerson benefited from 16 games as opposed to OJ's 14
Thank
games.
you.
And
Thank you, Jori. Thank you. I've been waiting for somebody to make this point that, and I knew this discourse was going to happen, that this was going to be this dumb, like, well, Saquon had an extra game.
To Eric Dickerson's credit,
Dickerson
he
had
said
2
a lot
more
of
games
things
with
last
OJ.
week. He did not say that. So I don't think that you have to give that back.
No.
But Saquon brought that up when they're like, oh, does it mean something that you got to 2016 instead of 17? He was like, not really. But I think what you really have to, so I asked this offensive coordinator, and they said what they would do is they would give Saquon a half and say, you have one half, we'll give you the offensive line, we'll give you this to go rush for it. If you don't get in the half, like, game over. But what actually probably would have been a better opportunity for them is if they just let Saquon stay in the last 11 and a half minutes last week. I recognize he might not have got it, but then you still have the bye week this week. You're not preparing for another game. You're just having last week's game, and it's like the same preparation. So look, Saquon said his family was disappointed. His father was disappointed that their name wouldn't be in the record books. But what he told them is, we didn't come to Philadelphia to break Eric Dickerson's record. We came to Philadelphia to win a Super Bowl. And I also will say, Saquon's such a class act in a lot of ways. One of which is they asked him what it would mean if he broke that record against the New York Giants, because the Eagles play the Giants this year. And obviously the Giants drafted Saquon. He wanted to stay there for his whole career. And then they didn't offer him anywhere near what the Eagles offered him. So he left. So they said, would it mean more to break this record against the Giants? And Saquon said, yes, but not for the reason that you think. You probably think that it would mean more because I'm able to show the Giants what I was able to do. But really, it would mean so much because think about the injuries I had in New York, the trainers, the strength staff who helped me get back to a place that I was able to continue my career, much less have a 2,000-yard season. To be able to celebrate with them on the same field, that's what would mean a lot. So I loved that. I just like Class X.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of those rare sports debates where I was fine either way. If Saquon was like, you know what, I want the record, I'd have been, okay, no problem with that. That is something that has to do with legacy. That's not selfish. That is your place in the game's history. We're talking about Eric Dickerson 30 years after he broke that record. That there's something to be said about records. There's something to be said about the Philadelphia Eagles being in a huddle, say, let's get 2,000. Like, I think that's awesome. And I have no problem if Saquon was like, yeah, I wanted to take a run at Eric Dickerson, whether it was going to be one half or a full game or whatever. I also have no problem with Saquon Barkley to Philadelphia Eagles being like, hey, you know what's pretty good for legacy too? win a Super Bowl in Philadelphia. let's our best foot forward is sitting you this week, resting guys, getting ready for this playoff run when we're a Super Bowl contender. So I was fine either way. And I'm a big proponent of like, look, the season is the season now, and arguing about who had more carries or more games, it doesn't matter. How many games are you playing? What's the record? If you beat the record, you beat the record. But it's not college football where they just randomly decided, let's add bowl games and not retroactively add the other bowl games. Like, that was stupid. And Ron Dane is still the all-time leading college football rusher. But I just think that, because all the people who are like, well, Eric Dickerson did it in 16 games. Well, yeah, OJ did it in 14, 1973, right. 2003. Like that. Then we erase Eric Dickerson.
Did it in 12.
Like this is just whatever the season is. Arguing about who had more games or more carries or whatnot. It just doesn't matter. What was the record? What were the rules in place? Did you break the record or not? But yes, in Saquon's case for this week, I do think ultimately it's a smart thing for him to sit because 2000 is still very, very historic. And to do it and to kind of try to break the record in a manufactured way in a game that he really doesn't need to be playing in like that would seem a little cheap. I wouldn't have a problem with it. But to do it this way of like, we got our 2000, that was our goal. That's what we talked about. We celebrated. And now let's go get a Super Bowl. I think is probably the perfect way to do it.
Right. 2000 was clearly the compromise here. So we'll let you get that, but not that. Although it's hard because the last time you played the Giants, 17 carries, 176 yards, over 10 yards a carry. So you're like,
he was going to do
close.
it. Have you watched the Giants play lately? He was going to do it.
I just feel like Saquon's probably lying in bed at night thinking like, what if we don't win a Super Bowl and this isn't the reason and we could have gotten the record and then I would have had that. And then on the other hand, you go, Saquon literally said on Sunday that he didn't know that division champions got t-shirts and hats. And he was like, what's this? Because he was so far from ever being in that New York. Only one time in his 6 years did they make the playoffs. They had like 9 wins in that season. The rest of the 5 years, they had 6 wins or fewer. And so you do have to recognize that this is a guy who understands how hard it is to have the kind of season that they're having. And on a related note, Lane Johnson was talking about that in his rookie year when he said he blocked for LaShawn McCoy as he led the league in rushing. And Lane Johnson's like, oh yes, this is what happens. We just kind of like block for guys who are the rushing champions. And then it takes 12 years to get back to that. And so I think similarly, Saquon has an understanding because of his time in the league and because of his time with a highly losing franchise, how difficult it is to have these kind of player opportunities.
I think this is one of those rare moments, too, guys, where everybody has to have a take on everything and a big opinion on everything. Like, it's just really simple to me. If Saquon decides, if they wake up Sunday morning and decide to put Saquon in to go for the record, awesome. And if, God forbid, there's an injury from that process, it's still a decision that I respect. And if they don't play him and they don't win a Super Bowl, it's still a decision I respect. Like, this is not a lose-lose. It's a win-win. The season he's had this year has been absolutely incredible. However, they choose between coach and player to let that end. I believe in my heart. I know Saquon said that, at first he didn't want to go for it, and then he woke up and did want to go for it, and coach is making him sit. I believe that if they sat down and if he was passionate about it and banged the table for it, I believe they'd probably listen to that. Also, at this point, it's been such a magical season. What I don't want to do is get mired in the result. I don't want the result to change the process. And the process of this was an MVP caliber season for Saquon. That's my only regret is that I think Saquon Barkley is the MVP of this year, not either of the quarterbacks. And if I had the chance to make a case for him to be the MVP, I think setting this record would make that an easier case to everybody to say, here is our MVP. He did something historic. Without that, it's a 2,000-yard season that we'll remember, but it takes him out of any running for it. So that's my only regret. But I do think this is win-win for the player and for the team.
Yeah, and I just, the dumbest thing I've heard this week, and I've heard it a few places, and you alluded to it, was
dummy.
Like, is well, if the Eagles don't win the Super Bowl, then this was the wrong call. Like, what are we doing? What? Like, you're not, like, Saquon Barkley sitting in week 18 is not guaranteeing the Eagles a Super Bowl. Like, this is stupid. Like, this is the best path to it. This is, what could we do to maximize our chances? You're not guaranteeing a Super Bowl by giving Saquon Barkley rest in week 18. That was, of all the, like, 16 versus 17 games and carries and all that was the dumbest take of like, well, you better win a Super Bowl or this was not worth it. Like, I guess, man, whatever. What do we even, at some point, what are we even doing here? Like, come on.
Yeah. And, no revenge against the Giants, but also not even needing to play in the game and deciding not to go for the record is still sort of revenge against the Giants. I'm just saying, and they're going to be sitting there looking at it from a sideline standpoint, understanding what's happened. All right, Stone has absolutely been our MVP. He is the Saquon Barkley. He is the unstoppable running force of this show. We appreciate everything he does behind the scenes.
By the way, are we not even spending 30 seconds on Vikings-Lions picks, the biggest game in regular season history?
Oh, yeah, we should do that. Go ahead, Frank. You just take over the hosting role.
I actually, for as much as I've been on this Lions bandwagon all offseason, and they're my Super Bowl pick, I'm picking the Vikings. I think they're playing much better ball right now. This Vikings team, I think, could go on the road and win at Detroit. And what I think I did a story on it this week. I think this is the biggest regular season matchup in NFL history. Like, if you look at all of the things at stake, we've never had the records, the what's at stake, 1 seed versus 5 seed, all that kind of stuff. It's a great game. And I'm picking the Vikings, the game of the year. Vikings just playing better on both sides of the ball.
Ooh, Jori, who you got?
I'm so excited to see Brian Flores against Ben Johnson again. I just love that chess match. I think it's so fun. I don't think that the result of this game is actually going to impact the result of a potential playoff match, which is to say, I don't think that if the Vikings win this week, they'll necessarily win if the two teams face off in the NFC playoffs. But I do think the Vikings will win this week. I agree. There's just a lot of injuries on Detroit. And I also think the Vikings are just kind of on one and building that momentum. But I still think I would probably pick the Lions in the playoffs. But maybe I just need to stop underestimating the Vikings and appreciate what they're able to do.
That's the thing. We've all underestimated. We talked about this. The Vikings were, betting wise, small underdogs at home to the Packers last week at some sports books. I'm like, what does it take the Vikings to get a little respect around here? If they win on Sunday night, they're probably the Super Bowl favorite, because the AFC, you could make an argument for a few teams, right? Even the Ravens now. I think if the Vikings are 2 home wins away from a Super Bowl, well, that's an easier path. I mean, this is a 15-2 Vikings team if they win on Sunday night with the 1 seed having to win 2 home games to make a Super Bowl. This is historic almost of what's on the line here. That whoever wins this game Sunday night has the far easier path to a Super Bowl, and neither of these franchises ever won one, as we know. I can't wait for this game. I think this is going to be just fantastic theater.
We're going to have to make Stone pick the Lions, because I'm also picking the Vikings here. The Lions are too decimated on the defensive side of the ball. They weren't going to stop the 49ers. They needed those 2 interceptions for Kirby Joseph. By the way, another Pro Bowl snub. Kirby Joseph deserved to make it. This is the way the Lions have to live the rest of the year. It's like the 2009 Saints. That's always the team I point out, in that great offense and the defense isn't good, but you have to figure out some way to make 2 or 3 turnovers a game, or huge plays, sacks at the right spot or whatever. That's the way the Lions have to live. If the Vikings can play turnover-free football on Sunday, they're going to win. The Lions are kind of going to have, if they don't pick off Brock Purdy twice on Monday night, that game's like 42-42 going into overtime type of deal. Like they just weren't going to get a stop.
Right. And I think you make a good point, but also on that Kirby Joseph note, Frank, is Pro Bowl voting happens earlier in the season. So when you're talking about him leading the league in interceptions in your article, I'm like, okay, well, yeah, if we voted now, whoever leads the league in interceptions would get on that list. But I also think with Detroit, we've talked about these injuries, and it's kind of been amazing how they keep overcoming them. But they recently overcame them against the Chicago Bears and the San Francisco 49ers, who have even more injury. Well, sorry, 49ers have even more injuries than they do, arguably, and maybe not by numbers, but
I think Lions have more guys on IR. If I'm
more
not mistaken,
guys on IR, but
yes, you're right.
The Niners
like
have more
McCaffrey
impact players who are not able to play, and the Bears, they're a struggle bus right now, and so the Vikings are going to give them a different kind of challenge than they've had the last couple of weeks.
Who's going to stop Justin Jefferson? And just like, who's going to stop Jordan Addison?
I feel bad for the Lions. I do, because if they lose, and who knows, like they might win out. Like they might win every game 42-34 the rest of the way. Fine, great. I feel bad for them, because this was their season, and then you just have the bad luck of injuries hit you. And I just don't think they can defensively, with all their injuries, I don't think they can win a Super Bowl, constituted as they are. We'll see on Sunday night. That's why I can't wait for this.
That's why Ben Johnson comes back for another season as offensive coordinator, unfinished business in Detroit. Look at me with all the conspiracy theories. Follow us on Twitter. You know how to find us. Inside Coverage will be back Sunday. We'll recap Week 18. Again, for the record, we all picked the Vikings, which means Stone was forced to pick the Lions so that we don't all get it wrong. Sorry, Stone. Didn't even get a say in that one. We appreciate you guys listening. Take the time to rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell Vikings fans to check it out, but maybe tell Lions fans to tune off before the last minute and a half of the show. That's all we ask on that. We appreciate you guys listening. We'll be back Sunday night. Have a great weekend.